Hello everyone, my name is Matt Radizak, and I'm an NXCAD application engineer from Prolim PLM. And in today's webinar, we're going to be covering a licensing overview for Solid Edge and NX. And my goal for this webinar is to teach everyone here a little bit about how the licensing systems for Solid Edge and NX work, so you guys can better understand how your licenses work and how to set up your own license systems. Jumping right into our agenda for today, I plan on going through node-locked and floating licenses and what are the differences between the two different licensing methods. We're going to go over how you can interpret your license, meaning how can you open it up, read it, and prepare it, your license file in order to use it for your licensing system. And what kind of information can you gather from your license file? We're also going to go through each of the different licensing methods. So we're going to go through Solid Edge node locked, Solid Edge floating, and there was a change between 2019 and 2020. So we're going to go over both different variants of those two. And then also Solid Edge 2020 and newer, their floating licensing method uses the same floating licensing method that NX uses. So those are all in the same category, but we'll go through all that. And there's some little deviations between them, but I'll talk about those as well. Then we'll move into NX node lock licensing, which is a little bit similar to NX floating because there's some overlap there as well, but I'll talk about that there as well. And then finally, we're going to talk about what it looks like for moving your license files. So when you inevitably have to get new hardware, whether that be for a server or a client machine, what that process looks like. How does that look for what you guys need to do on your end and what we need from you in order to move your license files, or what your other VAR or Siemens would need from you in order to move your license files. So you have a heads up on what that process looks like. And then the last section, I'm not actually going to go through all of these troubleshooting tips. I included this as like a future reference since this will be posted on YouTube. So you can go back and watch the video. I'll freeze frame for a little bit on those slides at the end so you can pause the video and look through those and read them. They're a little bit more bulky in text, but I wanted to include that so if you're someone who likes to work on issues on your own before contacting support, you don't like having to call someone every time an issue pops up. You can try those troubleshooting tips on your own and then call us if those don't work, or call your support line if those don't work. But I just wanted to include that as well, some of the things that I like to try when I first encounter issues when it comes to licensing. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about are node-locked and floating licenses and what is the difference between the two of them. So node-lock, I'm just going to go through each one individually first. So node-lock licensing is licensing that is tied specifically to your client machine. So this license is tied to either the CID2 in the case of Solid Edge or the MAC address in the case of NX to your client-side machine, so being the machine that is running Solid Edge or NX. Now, this license file can be stored on that machine in most cases. So like, for instance, Solid Edge, you would have the license file on your machine, and you simply try to launch Solid Edge, you get a licensing error, right? You say, I have a license file, and you point to it, and you're up and running. That's all you have to do. Now, NX is a little bit more complicated. It has one variant that works like that, where you just point to the license file. It's a little bit more complex than just saying I have a license file. But there's also a variant of NX where you kind of have like an intermediary between floating and node locked. So there might be a little bit more to that. But still, a node lock license is tied to the client machine. So it has that lock there. So only one specific machine can launch NX using that license. New license manager is required. So yeah, like I said, Solid Edge doesn't have to have a license manager, or if you, in one variant of NX node locked, you don't need a license manager in order to run the software. The change request forms. So the process that we're going to go over when we get to moving is a little bit different depending on if it's node locked or floating, and I'll talk about that later. And then one of the big benefits that customers go to node locked for is the off network use. So if you're a manager or an end user that's constantly traveling between sites and it's annoying to have to constantly switch what server you're pointing to pull a new license file, you might have a node lock license on your machine so that your machine runs separate from those networks. So you can just log in on your machine and run from it without having to constantly be repointing to a new server every time you move sites. Now, floating licensing. So the big benefit of floating licensing is the value that it brings with the users that are jump in and out of Solid Edge. So my favorite example of a floating license setup is 3 users that have one power user and say 2 users that are use Solid Edge. We'll just use Solid Edge as an example. Use Solid Edge maybe once or twice a week each, right? But the other user is using it all day, every day, all week. If you were to purchase node lock seats, you would need to buy 3 different seats, right, for your 3 different users so they can all run on their computers. If you purchase floating licensing, you would only need to purchase 2 licenses because you could purchase one floating license that's always going to be active because of that one user that's always running Solid Edge. Then the other 2 can share another floating license that they're not always in the software, so they're jumping in and out of it very infrequently. They're not really much in Solid Edge that often. So as long as the users 2 and 3 aren't trying to use Solid Edge at the same time, which in some cases they might, which you would have a hang-up, right? So maybe you would purchase it in the future if they start having more and more hang-ups. But to start, if you wanted to, you could purchase less software and those 2 could share that license. So it saves you money on the front end. So that's the value of floating licensing. Now, the floating license does have a tie-in to a machine, but on this side it's tied to the server. So for NX and Solid Edge 2020 and newer, it's tied to the CID. And for Solid Edge 2019 and older, it can be tied to the MAC address or a dongle. Dongle being a little USB drive that plugs into the server that verifies the license. Now the license manager is required. So this is an installation that'll happen on either a server or a client machine. So say for instance, back to my previous example, you actually don't have a server, right? So you're pushed away from floating because you don't have a server, right? And you don't have anything to host those licenses. What you could do, as long as you have a company network, so everyone runs on the same network, right? In your office, you might have the power user host the license manager as well on his machine so that he always has access to the license, right? But the other 2 users that pull the licenses can simply point to the client machine and use his client as if it was a server hosting the license manager. So you still have that ability if you don't have a physical server or a VM server setup that your company uses, or you haven't looked at purchasing one yet. You can still have the option of floating. Another I shouldn't say caveat, but another thing you have to look out for with floating licensing, with what I said about it being on the same network, your client machines, being the machines that are pointing to the server or the license manager, have to be able to see the server machine or the client machine hosting the license manager. And what I mean by see is they need to be able to ping that server. This is a very simple process. I'll show it a little bit later when we get into the floating licensing. I'll show an example of this, but all you have to do is you launch a command prompt window. You just type in CMD into Windows search bar. And then in the window that pops up, you can just type in ping, P-I-N-G, space, and then whatever the host name of the machine is that is hosting license manager, whether that be your server, whether that be a client machine, whether that be John's machine, whatever the name is, that host name. And then when you hit enter, it'll pull back a little report of whether or not it have received a response from the machine that it pinged. So it pings them, and then it sends a response back. And if you get a response back, that means there's a connection there, right? They can see each other. And that's what you need in order for the network system to work, for it to be able to look at that server. And there's a little bit more complications with this, but we'll talk about that a bit more later, specifically with the firewall, like I have noted here. And another thing I really like to mention, when you have multiple engineering softwares, a lot of these softwares use LM tools. This is the application that more or less you manage the license manager through. This LM tools application can you can get a bunch of these, right? If you have Solid Edge, NX, AutoCAD, Team Center, well, Team Center and NX kind of share the same one, but they in all versions. But all these different softwares pile up, and you have multiple LM tool applications. So you go into Windows search bar, and if you constantly go into the Windows search bar and search for LM tools and run it from there, you might be running any of those different LM tools applications, right? And inside the LM tools, there is an option to change which service you're trying to use. But generally, my recommendation is to have if you're on a server that has all those different CAD software LM tools on it, my general recommendation is to have a LM tool shortcut for each individual one. So I have an LM tool shortcut for my Solid Edge LM tools, where my Solid Edge license manager is installed, a shortcut for my Siemens PLM license server, which would be NX, license LM tools. That way I have separation, right? And this is just to avoid little issues like messing up the licensing server by having it on the wrong service while having it launched from the wrong location, and everything gets wonky. So it just for sake of consistency and just keep everything nice and easy, I like to do it that way because you can run into issues when running the same LM Tools application for all those different services. So that's my recommendation. And then again, I have noted the CID change request form for floating because there's some variance between whether it's a solid edge node locked versus the other methods for how the moving license process works. All right, and now how to read your license and how to prepare it. So this is the section where I want to talk about the license file specifically. So the first thing I want to talk about is that the file itself, when you first receive it from either Siemens, VAR, or whoever, it will be a .txt file. And I think this is for the sake of the email, because when you get sent an email with a .lic, it's usually caught by spam filter or junk. So it's usually sent as a .txt file. This file needs to be saved as a .dat or a .lic. You can change a .txt to either of these file formats by either just going into Save As, changing the drop down to all files, and then just selecting or just typing in at the end of the either, I think it's usually license underscore UGSLMD or SE license. Change that extension from .txt to .lic or .dat, or just add a .lic or .dat to the end of the SE license while that dropdown is set to all files, and then it'll save it as that file type. What you can also do, if you're a little bit more savvy with Windows, in the File Explorer window, when you have file extensions turned on, you can actually just right-click, rename the file, and just change that extension from a .txt to a .lic or .dat. It'll pop up with a little error message. It's like, are you sure you want to do this? This could corrupt the file. You can do that. It's fine. It's just a notepad file anyway. It's already encrypted, and it won't cause any issues with the file. Now, actually inside the license file, the first section I want to talk about is the top little section that's surrounded by pound signs. Now, this area is more or less like your account information. So this includes your sold to, which is more or less an account number through Siemens that hosts your licenses, bundles or licenses. You can have multiple of these sold tos per company. So like, for instance, back when Solid Edge was, in the older days of Solid Edge, when it used a different license manager, the newer ones can now be posted on the same license server. But the older ones, you would have to keep on a separate license or a separate sold to. So the older companies might have multiple sold to set up where you have a Solid Edge sold to, an NX sold to, a Team Center sold to, and so on and so forth. Or you might have a bunch of old sold tos from having done trials in the past. So those are the account numbers where your licenses are stored. Then you have your contact information. So this is your primary contact at your company is usually listed. So it might be an engineering manager, it might be an owner, it might be an office manager. Whoever is going to be, you want to receive the license file, the regularly updated license file for your company. So say, for instance, when Solid Edge 22 comes out, Siemens automatically sends out license files to all their customers. Whoever you want to receive that license will probably be listed on this license. If it's the incorrect person, we can change, or you can have that changed either through us if you are our customer, or your VAR or Siemens. But you can have that changed. But this is just who it's listed to, right? You also have your customer name, and then obviously email address for the primary contact. On the right-hand side, we have our WebKey access code, which is used to create your WebKey account. So if you want to create a WebKey account where you can log in and either download the software yourself, or look at the different forums that Siemens has on their support center, or different ERs and PRs that have been logged, you can see all kinds of different information about those things. You would use this WebKey access code to create an account. So what you do is you would go into Siemens Support Center and you would try to create an account, right? And it would pop up asking for your sold to and your WebKey access code. This is where you get that WebKey access code. And this is just to make sure that the person trying to make an account with your sold to number is actually an employee of your company, and not just some random person who just threw some numbers in for the sold to and randomly got in, right? So this is just a security measure, more or less. You have a created date, and then we also have a version number. And this version number is really important in that the version of a license file has to match the version of the license manager, but neither of those need to match the version of software being run. And what I mean by that is Solid Edge, or I probably shouldn't use Solid Edge as an example because it's a little wonky right now, but NX12. If I wanted to run NX12 on my client machine, so say you're first time buying NX and you're buying NX because a supplier is running NX and you need to have the same version as them and they use NX12. So you buy NX and you get an NX 1980 file and you're running NX12. You can still run NX12 with an NX 1980 license file. You just need an NX 1980 license manager to be up and running with that NX 1980 license. An easy way of referring to this is that the NX license is backwards compatible, and that a newer license file will always work with older versions of NX. And another benefit with NX is that you can have multiple versions installed. Like for instance, on my machine, I have probably 6 versions of NX installed, maybe 7 now, on my machine at any given point in time, just so I can run any version that a customer might have issues with. So that's why you're able to keep running with those license files even after you've upgraded to a newer version, even if you're staying on an old version. Some customers even upgrade their license manager even when they have no intention of upgrading to a new version yet. So, and a reason why I didn't use Solid Edge as an example at the beginning was because Solid Edge in 2020 changed their licensing system. So they have a cutoff of backwards compatibility. So Solid Edge 2020 cannot run anything 2019 or older. So you cannot run any software other than Solid Edge 2020 with a Solid Edge 2020 license manager and license file. But 2019 is backwards compatible with everything prior to it. So because of that, it makes the backwards compatibility a little wonky. So I used NX as an example for that rather than Solid Edge. Now moving into the some more of about the inside of the license file. So let me go ahead and open up a license file real quick for you. Get this open. There we go. So this license file, as an example, in this very first line, what I can gather from this line right here, this server line, this tells me that this license file that I received is a floating license. It is a dongle-based license, and I know which computer it's meant for. And how do I know that? So the server line just existing tells me that it's a floating license. So node-locked licenses do not have this server line. The name following the server, so this server right here, tells me the host name of the machine that this license is intended for or was specified for. So when this license was generated, it was generated with this name. So I know that it was generated for the purpose of being used on this machine. Some cases, what might happen is you order Solid Edge or NX for the first time, and you receive an email from them requesting you to run a utility on your server or whatever machine's going to be hosting the Solid Edge license file, right? So you run it on a machine and you send them back the CID, but you don't send them the host name of the machine. This might say your host name. You can change the text right here in this license file. So you can come in and type in here and change the value to whatever you want, and it won't matter. As long as you don't touch the spaces before, the spaces before or after, wow, I said that backwards, but before or after the host name, you'll be fine. Because the license file is encrypted, so changing any of the text in here will corrupt the file and make it unusable, but certain areas are changeable. Then the area following it gives me the Solid Edge hardware key ID, and this tells me that it's a dongle-based license, because only dongles use a hardware are listed as a hardware key ID. If it was a CID, it would say composite. If it was a MAC address, I believe it says host ID for the what the license restriction is. So depending on what that says, that tells me what is being restricted. So me seeing this, I know I'm supposed to have a dongle in this machine to host the license server. And that might be incorrect. You might have received a dongle-based license when you were intending on getting a MAC address-based license. So you might need to contact Siemens or your VAR and verify that maybe it's still in processing, getting it converted to a unique host ID method. So which is what the license is commonly referred to as for the MAC address-based Solid Edge license. So that might tell you, oh, this license file isn't going to work. Before you get frustrated trying to set it up and are confused why it's not working. Like a good example of that is if you, a lot of times customers will have a server set up and they purchase Solid Edge, say Solid Edge 2019, they're planning on running 2019, and they run a virtual machine. Virtual machines I have seen in one case I've seen it work where they've gotten a dongle to work. I don't know what they did. The IT did some IT magic. I'm not an IT guy, so I don't know how they did it. But they made it so that the VM could recognize a USB port on the physical machine that was hosting the VM. But in most cases, you cannot get a dongle-based license to work with the VM. But if customers don't tell the VAR that, or the VAR doesn't ask that, if they forget about it or don't think about it at the time, the license file you are by default going to get is this hardware key ID based license, and it won't work with your VM. So you have to get a unique host ID method. So you might get frustrated trying to figure out why it's not working, and it's because you have a dongle-based license that a VM can't recognize. And then the last thing in this line right here is the port number. So this is also a changeable area where you can type in here. This is the port number that you're letting Solid Edge License Manager host the license through. So this is the port that it goes back and forth through the server. You might need to let this through the firewall, depending on your security or whatever. But we'll talk more about firewall again later. But this is where that port is specified in terms of the license file. Now, further down, we have our increments. And what each of these increments represent is a specific license. So if I come all the way down, I have my license product, and this is where it's going to list all my bundles, right? All the different bundles for what I've purchased for this sold to for this license. And in this sold to license, all I have is this Solid Edge demo bundle. And in that demo bundle, it includes these licenses. There's going to be an increment for each one of those licenses. Right? So each one of these increments specifies for that specific license. Now, for instance, with this SE 3D publishing, you might notice, why does it have a date in there, right? That date is an expiration date. In most cases, when you see a date here, or when you look at your license file, you won't see a date here, unless you either have a subscription-based license, a trial license, or some kind of like a beta license, maybe the beta licenses have this as well. Those kinds of licenses will have these expiration dates. Most of the time, what it will say here is permanent. Now, if, say, for instance, this had the date and this license didn't, which obviously it does, this license would expire, but my license would still work for all the other softwares listed. just this one increment would no longer work. So that's another thing you can read from your license file. You can take away from it. So you can tell, oh, why did so-and-so no longer have a license file? You open up your license file, it's like, oh, it has an expiration date for some reason. So it might be something to do with when the license file was generated, it might have not had all the information required for the license file. It might have been a temp file. A lot of times, what you'll see with the customers transfer for us when they transferred to the new license method of 2020, it uses a different restriction method. So customers that had Solid Edge 2019 and were moving to 2020, if they didn't have that restriction method put in, the license file that would be generated was just a temp file that would expire after a couple days. So then they would need to we would need to go in and put in a composite host ID, the number used to restrict the license file to a server, so that it was restricted. So that's the kinds of things you can take away from your license file. Some other information that's given in these increments is obviously you have the increment name or the license name, so SE3D Publishing. And in some cases with, let me go ahead and open up an NX license real quick. With NX, you might have these bundles. So you might have a bundle number instead that gives the bundle that the license is for. So you might see that as well. Those are just an identifier for what the license is and what is all is included in that bundle. Now, this is a floating license, right? So what's the difference between this and a node locked? If I just go ahead and open up a Solid Edge node lock license, this one's much shorter, but with this license, you can tell that there isn't either a server line or a vendor line. So both those lines no longer exist. And then also, you'll notice in my feature, my license actually has this host ID line right here, this composite host ID, composite to yada, 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 some series of numbers. This is where the license is restricted in your file. So you can see what the CID that license is restricted to. So what's the value in knowing this? So for instance, you do a license change form, or not a change form, but you go in and change your license, right? Not necessarily through a var, maybe you did it yourself, and you type that number in and you try and run it and it doesn't work. You might open up your license file and go into your feature and see that the license hasn't changed, right? It's still using the old CID2 because it hasn't been updated. So you might have to go in and you might have to wait an hour or two for the system to recognize the change and let you generate a file with the correct CID. Rather than spending all this time trying to figure out what's wrong with it, it's just the license file was generated. It was not updated yet. So it just saves you that time and might save you that frustration of trying to fix something that isn't really something you need to fix. It's something that you just have to wait on to get updated. Don't save. So that's it for the general overarching how to read your license file. Oh, down here at the bottom though, I do have a little thing for the bundle of NX, the bundles of NX. So for instance, you might see NX 12,446 listed, and then that is the bundle information, and then you have the actual name of the bundle of licenses that is included, or the actual license feature. This might not necessarily be a bundle. I should stop saying bundle, but it should it'll be the license feature number and then the license ID number and then the name of that license. And then again, this one has an expiration date and a host ID. So this one is specifically a node lock license. So now we're going to get into the different licensing methods specifically, and each one on their own. So Solid Edge node lock licensing uses the CID2 of the client machine. And something I want to mention straight at the beginning is CID2 and CID are different numbers. They are different overarching numbers that are determined by different algorithms. So the number isn't going to be the same for any machine. And what this number is determined by is a variety of different factors. So you have your host name of your machine, you have your graphics card, you have the amount of RAM in your computer, the version of Windows. Even big Windows updates have caused the CID to change before on very rare occasions, albeit, but it has done it in the past. And with these changes to CID, with these changes, whether you add more RAM, you change the host name of a computer. Probably the most common one is when customers change the host name of a computer, and the CID will change. So then your license is no longer valid because you need to get a new license file with the updated CID, right? So the CID2 is what restricts that file. So just be careful and think ahead, or try to remember that changing those things on your computer will change that CID. So before you do it, you might want to just go ahead and contact us, tell us you're going to change it, then give us the new CID immediately so we can just get the new license file out to you. Now, with Solid Edge Node Lock license, it's very, very easy to change the license on Siemens end or on your VAR's side. We can very easily go into the system and just change that. All we need to know is the CID of the old machine. So what the CID was prior to what we're changing it, and the CID after. As long as we know those two things, we can go ahead and change it. Now, the only reason we need the CID before is because for customers that have, say, 10 seats of Solid Edge Node Locked, those 10 seats can be categorized a little bit. They have like a naming convention, but for us, all we see is that little name, which might be John for all 10 of them, and then the CID. So knowing the old CID tells us which one's being retired, so we can turn that one off and replace the new one with that license that the old one was using. So that's why we asked for the old one. If you only have one seat, it's really easy. We just turn off the one that's existing and then put it on the new CID. It's easy. But for the customers that have multiple seats, it just helps figure out which one's which. Because if you don't have the old one and you have 10 different seats, well, now we have to go to the 9 other computers and figure out those CIDs to nitpick down to the one that's being retired. Now, in terms of setup, this is very straightforward. So with Solid Edge Node Locked, all you need to do is you take your license file that you received, prepare it in whatever way. So for Solid Edge Node Lock licenses, all you have to do is just save it as a .lic or .dat file. That's all you have to do. And then you select I have a license file, and you browse to that license file. So once you hit the I have a license file right here, a little browse button will open up on this little section of the window. You click browse, and then point to that file and hit OK. And Solid Edge will automatically recognize that file being the license for the system, and then it'll launch Solid Edge using that license. Now, the location you have your license file matters in newer versions, but it doesn't as much in older versions. And what I mean by this is that in Solid Edge 2019, if I had a license file on my desktop and I pointed my Solid Edge to it via this license utility and hit OK, what Solid Edge would do was it would copy that license file and put it in the Solid Edge preferences folder. So C drive, program files, Siemens, Solid Edge 2019, preferences. That'd be the full path. And it would put that license file in there, make a copy of it and put it there. What the newer versions do is they just point to the file on the desktop. They just tell Solid Edge, this is where your license is. Now, that works, but the problem is that you have now your license file sitting on the desktop where it can easily be deleted. So you might want to throw that somewhere, like in your documents folder, in a folder that's just called Solid Edge license or something, just so it doesn't get deleted. You don't want to accidentally delete your license and then a week later when you actually need to launch Solid Edge or when you next need to launch Solid Edge, you just can't because your license file was deleted and you don't know where it went. So I like to recommend customers to do that. And I should mention too that I should have mentioned this earlier, but the CID2, you can retrieve that value via the Solid Edge license utility. So if you have Solid Edge installed on your computer, if you run the license utility, you can actually see it listed here, the composite 2 number. In older versions, I think it's listed up here in the corner, but you can get that value from that utility. For computers, like if you're a new customer and you don't have the download for Solid Edge yet, if you need to get the CID of Siemens, or your VAR can provide you with the utility to pull that number without having to make you install Solid Edge. It's just a little executable you run, and it'll pop up with a window that tells you the CID, and you can just send that back to them. Now, moving into Solid Edge 2019, we're going to be talking about the 2019 and older floating licensing. So this is Solid Edge 2019, ST10, ST9, so on and so forth. Now, each of these versions have two different variants of licensing. They have dongle-based and they have MAC address-based. And MAC address is commonly referred to as the unique host ID method. And that's what your license on your WebKey account will even say is unique host ID method next to your SE license. The location of the license manager will be your C drive SE Flux program folder. And then the dongle side of this licensing variant is kind of finicky in that you need to make sure that the dongle is unplugged from the server or the client machine that's hosting the license manager during the installation process. Otherwise, you could screw up the dongle. So the setup process looks like you would just install the license manager. So you go through and follow the step-by-step instructions for the license manager. You can just do by the default settings for everything. And eventually it will pop up asking you for a license file. You can specify here either a permanent license file, if it is the permanent one that you've already received, or a temporary or dummy license file to just get the server installed. Because you can change this license file with the software already installed. And I'll walk you through that process as well. Once the license manager is installed, verify that if you do have a dongle, you also install the Sentinel driver, which should be in the same folder as the license manager. There should be a folder called Sentinel driver in there, and you just run the executable in that folder. Once that's all done, plug the dongle into the server, go to that installation directory, that C drive SE Flux program file folder, and run LM Tools. Now, I'm going to go ahead and open up LM Tools to show you what this looks like. So this is going to look a little bit different in that for SE Flux, you're going to have down here, you'll just have this FlexNet. For me, I have these two. The reason I'm not using FlexNet is because I have a node-locked Solid Edge license, and I don't have a floating one to demonstrate with. So I'm just going to be using my Siemens PLM license server, which is the Solid Edge 2020 and newer, and NX license server. It works exactly the same. It just doesn't use a dongle or anything. It's just CID based. So it works a little bit differently, but the LM Tools runs the same, and that's what matters. And that's what I'm trying to show here. So what you would do is you go to Start Stop Reread and stop your server. Start the server once it says stopping server, and then wait for this to say server start successful. Then hit reread. Now this might hang up a bit and might even say not responding up here. And once that says reread completed, go to server status and hit perform status inquiry. Now what this is going to tell us is all the information about the license manager that we need to know about how it's running and how is it up and running, is it running correctly? And the two things we need to look for here are license server up, vendor daemon on. As long as we know these two things, we know the license server is up and running, and we know the vendor daemon is currently on, so that we know the licenses are being distributed. Now, if this were to say vendor daemon off, for an example of something that, if something was going wrong with the system, my typical reaction to vendor daemon off is the license file doesn't match the server. So this might mean the license file is restricted to a CID, or the dongle is not plugged in, or a MAC address is incorrect, right? So the CID doesn't match, the MAC address doesn't match, or the dongle isn't plugged in. That's my first instinct on why the vendor daemon would be down. So I like to verify that first. But what that means, though, is that the license server cannot distribute licenses. So When we have these two pieces of information, knowing it's up and on, we know that it can distribute licenses as long as a client can point to it. So how do we set up the client to point to the server, right? Now, setting up the client to point to the server is actually is very simple, especially for Solid Edge, in that you have two different options. You have the license utility. For 2019, you really just have the license utility, but there's two different methods using the license utility. You can either do it via the I have a license server name and then type in the name of the license server, or you can say I have a license file and point to a copy of the license file that's on the server, that's on the client side, and then it'll make a copy of that and put it in the preferences folder for you. And it points to it through that, because in the license file, you know how it has that server line that has the server name. It uses that to point to it instead. Now, there is one other method. There is an environment variable you can create that will point Solid Edge to it. I believe it's SELMD underscore license underscore server. And that will point, it would be that would be the name of the variable, and the value of the variable would be 27,001 at the server name. So that's less commonly used, but you can use that environment variable. I know a couple customers that use that, but typically I generally always go with the license utility and just point it that way. I'm pretty sure doing the I have a license server name does something with the environment variable as well there, but I'm not 100% sure on that. And again, this slide just continues on off of what I was talking about with the vendor daemon up and on, or license server up and vendor daemon on, and then I have a license file. Now, what I wanted to mention though about the if you were, say for instance, you used a dummy file during installation or a temp file, and now you have your permanent file. How do I open up LM Tools and change that license file out? It's very similar to what we just did. All you have to do is you come into config services, and right here it has this path to license file. You just hit browse, point to your license wherever it is. It points to that path, and then you can save service to save where it's pointing. Then you go to start, stop, reread, stop the server, start the server, reread license file, and then go to server status. Now, a common thing that'll happen with LM Tools is when you go to stop the server, it'll say failed to stop server or something along those lines. What you might have to do is you might have to go into Windows Services. So Windows search bar, type in services, and this little window will pop up, and you can come down to Siemens PLM license server for the SPLM license server. For Solid Edge, I think it's called Solid Edge License Manager. And you just go here, right click, and say stop. I actually might even have the Solid Edge one. Let me make sure. Let me see if I can find what it's called. FluxNet License Manager is what it's referred to in services. So you can stop it that way as well. Then once it's stopped, you would come into LM Tools and start it from there. And then reread server status. And then you can verify that it's working with the permanent license file by coming into server status, perform status inquiry, and verifying, again, license server up, vendor daemon on. And this, you'll see this is a common thing throughout the rest of this webinar, is the usage of LM Tools to manage the license server, because it's all the same. They all use the same user interface. I do not want to save any of those. And now we'll jump forward to 2020 and newer and NX floating licensing. So with these license managers or licensing systems or softwares, they are tied to the CID of the server. So this is the normal or just the CID, not the CID2. And this is installed at the C drive, program files, Siemens PLM license server folder. So this is where you'll find your LM Tools and all your executables that LM Tools uses to manage your license files. Again, the CID will change if you make changes to the server. So if you add RAM to the server, change the host name of the server, the CID will change. So you'll have to get the license change with it, which we'll cover in a minute. So the installation process, again, is extremely similar to how the SE Flux install went, except this time you don't have to worry about a dongle because there's no dongle method for this. It's all CID based. So again, you just follow the same steps. Install license manager, step-by-step process, point to the license file, run on tools, and then you can do a server status. So you don't have to do a stop, start, reread when you first install it if you're pointing to a temp file or a permanent file. You can just do server status, perform status inquiry, and see if it's up and running. And if it isn't up and running, you might just want to try stop, start, reread, and then perform status inquiry just to see maybe it needs to restart it again. And it might work, it might not. And then you could go to the troubleshooting tips if it still isn't working. Most likely it's because a license file doesn't match, if I had to guess. Now, the difference between these two systems, the Solid Edge 2019 and Solid Edge 2020 and NX licensing, is the way you point the clients to the server. So with Solid Edge and NX, Solid Edge 2020 and NX, you would use an environment variable, which you can access via your system environment variable. So if you search in your Windows search bar, again, environment variable, select edit the system environment variables. So let me go ahead and just get that open real quick. And I click environment variables. Down here in the bottom half of the screen, I have my system environment variables, and right here is my SPLM license server. This variable is what points my client machine to my server. Now, in this case, my server is on the same machine as my client machine. So it's pointing to my local host or my machine name. This laptop host name, that's my machine's host name. So it's pointing directly to it because it's on the same machine, right? Now, there is something special about this, though, in that Solid Edge will use the same SPLM license server variable by default, but you can also specify SE license server. I actually learned this rather recently with the new system, where if you have two different servers, right? So right now, my Solid Edge license is pulling because my node locked isn't working. My node lock license actually expired, so my computer is pointing to our company server and is using that server as to host the license file back to my machine. So I'm just pulling from that instead. But Solid Edge will prioritize this SE license server over the SPLM license server. So even though Solid Edge can also use SPLM license server, it's still going to use SE license server first. So if you're ever in that situation where you have both NX and Solid Edge and you have two different servers, you might need that. But that you probably won't ever need to use that, but it's just a fun little thing that you can also use SE license server to point Solid Edge to it. So if you wanted to have two different variables pointing to the same server, and then that way you can just know which one's which, SPLM is NX, SE is Solid Edge, just to help. Maybe that'll help you understand which one's pointing to what. You could do that. And then once you're done with that, you can just go over to NX or Solid Edge and try and launch it to see if it'll pull a license, right? Now, something I did want to mention. I mentioned it earlier, I think, with 27,001 environment variable, but the 28,000 at the front or the 27,001 at the front is just the port number. So that port number just has to match whatever you have in the license file. So in the license file, when I showed you how it had the 27,001, the variable would have to match that. In all NX and Solid Edge 2020 and newer license files, they all have 28,000 by default. So that's what my variable is set as. And something else as a quick note, with NX specifically, there's this thing that you'll get when you first launch NX if you don't have like a special bundle that just automatically applies, like mine does with a demo bundle. But you'll probably get a license bundle error when you first launch it. And this isn't a licensing error. This is just NX saying, hey, we need to know which license you want. So what you would do is you go into Windows search bar and type in licensing tool. Let me see here. Doesn't want to pop up for some reason. There we go. So I got my licensing tool. You go to bundle settings, and you'll have a bundle here. You just select that, click this little arrow to apply it, hit apply, close out, and relaunch NX, and you're good to go. That's all there is to it. It's just solid. So with Solid Edge, what it does is it automatically pulls a classic license, and then until you need a premium, it gives you that classic, and then as soon as you try to pull something that requires a premium, it swaps it out. With NX, it requires you to go and tell it what you're trying to pull. So you go back, tell it, I want the CAD CAM 2.5 axis milling. That's the license I want to pull right now because that's what I want to work with. And then when you're done, you can put it back and or trade it out for a new one or whatever. So NX just requires you to do that. Now, moving into NX node lock licensing. So this is a little bit different in that it can be two different setups, right? You have normal node lock, standalone node lock, which is similar to Solid Edge, where it's a file that you point to. And then you have what you usually get, because standalone is actually pretty rare, is your typical node locked, is what I call it, where it has the CID of the server and the MAC address of the client as well. So it's still a floating license, but it's got an extra restriction on the client machine. So why does that exist? Why this exists is because a lot of the lower end NX bundles are node locked only. And customers that have a lot of NX licenses have floating. So what they want to do is they want to keep all those licenses in one place. So that what they did was they made a combination license where the CID is tied to the server. So the license stays on the server, but in that increment, it still has that host ID, the MAC address that locks it to that machine. So when that guy who can pull that license goes to pull a bundle, he can see that bundle that no one else can see because it's node locked and only he can pull it. So that's the difference between the two. Is one has an extra level of restriction, whereas the standalone is just a file that just sits on your computer and you just point to it and you can run. Now, the setup for this is very straightforward. For standalone, it's very straightforward. For MAC address, it's exactly the same as what it was for floating for NX. It's exactly the same. The only difference is when you go to apply your bundle, you'll just have that extra license available. So you would select that one because if it's locked to your machine, you're probably going to be using that one only. Then for the standalone setup, you just install NX on your client machine, follow the step-by-step process. When it comes to installing the CAD software, Solid Edge, NX, it's very straightforward. Just follow the steps on screen, install to all the default locations. You don't have to do anything fancy. I generally just select all the standard settings on default, and then I customize it after the fact, depending on which software you're using. Place your license file on the client machine. So this is, again, the standalone, where it won't be easily deleted. So again, make a folder somewhere, throw it in there, and then copy the path, because we're going to use that a couple times here. So in the top of the File Explorer, copy the path to that license file, so we have it. Now we're going to go into the licensing tool again. Let me go and open that up again to show you. And we're going to go into environment settings. And you're going to click edit here. And you're just going to paste that path right in this little text box and hit save. Now what that'll do is it's telling NX, I don't want to point to a server, I want to point to a path on my machine. And it'll look to that path of the license file. Now that'll change it here, but I want to change it in one other place as well, because as far as I know, NX will by default use SPLM license server no matter what. So what I like to do is verify that doesn't exist after I've changed this. So in the window, so once you have licensing tool set up, I would go to your system environment variables again and check to see if there's an SPLM license server environment variable. If there is, change the variable name to SPLM license file, and then replace the value, which is probably a server path of 28,000 at, to the file path that we copied, and then hit OK. If the SPLM license server variable doesn't exist, just make an SPLM license file variable and use that same path. And again, you might get a license bundle error when you try to apply it. When you try to first launch a Next, you might have to go back into licensing tool and apply that bundle. So again, with all those different licensing methods, there's a lot of overlap there. So the systems look very similar, but there are some little deviations between them. So that might make it confusing if you're ever jumping around between different softwares or different versions of softwares. Now, we're going to get into moving your license files. So the general process, I'm just going to give a general overview for this section because it's pretty much two different methods, right? You have solid edge node locked, which is contact your VAR or Siemens. You can even do this yourself too as well. Just so you know, you can log into your WebKey and you can change these on your own. If you make a WebKey account, you can go in and change the CIDs and apply your licenses to different CIDs on your own if you wanted to. But if you contact your VAR or Siemens to change it for you, you just need to provide the new CID of the machine, which license you want to put on that CID, and the old CID or the CID of the machine that is being retired, so that they can find which one to retire and then put the new one, that one's license on the new CID. Very straightforward and very easy to do. No second step or anything like that. Now for all the other ones, including NX node locked, Solid Edge 2019 and older floating. Well, 2019 and older floating is if you have a MAC address based license. If you have dongle based, it's a little special. You can just unplug the dongle, move, and you carry the dongle with you because the dongle is what verifies the license file. So you don't have like a number that's changing. You just take the dongle with you and put it in a new machine, and then you can run that. So for the MAC address based licenses and the CID based server licenses, you have to use the license change request form, which you would contact either Siemens or your VAR to provide for you. And they would send you a document with, what they would ask, might fill it out for you if you send them the information. But the information needed for the document is the version of license needed, so 1980, 2021, whatever. The retired CID or MAC address, the retired or host name, and then if there is one, if the host name is being retired, and then the new CID MAC address and host name. So, for instance, if you're changing a NX node locked license that's hosted on a server, you would need, if you're changing the server out, like the server is being changed and the client machine is being changed, you would need to fill out that form to change the host name, the CID, and the MAC address. All three. If you're filling it out for a Solid Edge 2019 floating, and it's just the MAC address to change because you changed out the NIC card on a machine, which is what determines the MAC address, by the way. It's a little component in your computer. If you change that component out and the MAC address changes, the only thing you need to fill out in that form is the retired MAC address and the new MAC address. And then once we have either the VAR sends it to you after they filled it out for you to sign, or you sign it and send it to your VAR or Siemens. Siemens will then process that form, and once that gets processed, they will send you an updated license file with the change. And then you just follow the same process of setting up your license on the new machine. The same setup process that we just went through for all those different variants. Now, troubleshooting tips. So this is, I'm going to go ahead and leave this open. So if you wanted to screenshot it, or if you want to go back and rewatch this video on YouTube, so you can pause this video and read through these. These are just some of my first things I try. General process of what I do is I go into, if I know there's something wrong, right? You can't pull a license file. The first thing I do is I go to the license server and I do a server status to see if the server is up and running. If it is, then I know that the issue lies in the connection between the client and the server somewhere, right? If the license server isn't running, then I know I need to fix the license server first. Whether that be a license file that needs to be changed, whether or not, like some For instance, you might need to put the host name in the license file, or you might need to change the CID because the server changed and you didn't think you needed to do that. So then once I get the new license file and I put it in the machine and it's up and running, the license server's up and running, but the client still can't pull a license. Now I know that there's a connection issue. Now, my first thing with connection issues is I usually go to the firewall. With the firewall, I will make exceptions or rules, inbound and outbound rules, for 3 different applications. Those 3 different applications are going to be listed on the next slide here. Now I've given enough time to people to pause this or screenshot it. That list the 3 different applications that you can let through the firewall. And these 3 applications are listed here as Elm Tools, UGS, Elm Tools, UGS-LMD, and LMGRD.exe. Those 3 executables just need to have an inbound rule for each of them and an outbound rule for each of them. And if you want to, you can also do a inbound-outbound rule for a port and do it for whatever port that your license goes through. Then I would go back to the client and see if that fixed it. Most of the time, that does. Oh, excuse me. That does fix it. If that doesn't work, then my next step that I like to check is back on the server side. This usually comes up earlier. Usually this is something that comes up when you're trying to get the server to start or stop and it just doesn't want to start or stop. In the services, there's a option if you go into the properties of the SPLM License Manager service and go to the Log On tab, verify that that is set to standard user. Here, let me check and show that real quick. This is actually coming up a lot more often recently. It used to be very rare, but this comes up pretty frequently nowadays. Siemens PLM license server. I passed it. There it is. You can go to properties, log on, and verify this is checked to local system account right here, or this is bubbled for local system account. You don't have to check this box or anything. Sometimes it'll be checked to this account and then it doesn't have permissions to start the service or stop the service. And I think in the past it's also caused issues with clients trying to connect. So just make sure that that's set to local system account. I'm not an IT guy, so I don't know what that does. I don't know what the implications of that is. I just know that that has fixed that issue for me. An IT guy might know why. It might be something with the installation process if you have permissions when you installed the software. It does seem to me like it's more so when customers install it without having admin rights. That might happen more often than not. But that is the go-to check. One of the go-to checks for me is to check this setting. Then if all that doesn't work and it still isn't connecting, my last guess is to go to antivirus. So antivirus can block this stuff. So then I would check antivirus, and 99% of the time, that'll fix it. Otherwise, it's almost always like some kind of network connection issue where the network isn't strong enough to manage a connection between the 2 machines, the other 1%. And then from the antivirus perspective, that's going to change depending on what antivirus you have. So I can't really give you set instructions on how to let those through. But again, you want to try and let these 3 executables through the antivirus. And that'll be it for today's webinar. Again, my name's Matt Radizak, and I'm an NX CAD application engineer here at Prolim. This video will be posted on YouTube. I'm sorry it was a bit longer than usual. I wanted to do this all in one big chunk rather than in separate videos because they kind of overlap, and I wanted it to make it easy for someone to pick a section and watch that section on whatever their licensing method is. I kind of jumped around a little bit throughout there. It might make it a little bit difficult to rewatch, and then also for the sake of those troubleshooting tips, if you want to go back and reread those later on, feel free to go to the YouTube channel and just pause the video during those and just read through those troubleshooting tips I have listed. So thank you and have a good day. And we will be opening up for questions. So.